For 3 years, Caleb Morgan, a single father, sorted mail at Westbridge Technologies, and the company treated him as if he were nothing. One day before the new CEO arrived, branch CEO Vanessa Sloan fired him in front of hundreds of employees, tore the badge off his shirt, and threw it on the floor. Caleb picked it up and walked out through the laughter. The next morning, the staff gathered to welcome their new leader. The executive elevator opened, and Caleb stepped out in a navy suit. Who was the mailroom worker they had mocked for 3 years? The mailroom of Westbridge Technologies sat at the back of the ground floor, past the loading dock behind a door that most employees had never opened. There were no windows. The light came from 2 rows of fluorescent tubes, one of which had been flickering since the previous winter, and nobody had filed a request to replace it. Caleb Morgan arrived every morning at 6:40 before the lobby turnstiles were switched on, and by the time the building filled with people, he had already sorted several hundred envelopes into the wooden slots along the wall. He was 38, and he had been doing this for close to 3 years. The work had a rhythm to it that most people never noticed. Certified mail went in one tray interoffice in another, anything from the parent company in a third that he handled last and handled carefully. Then he loaded the cart in old steel frame with a wheel that pulled slightly to the left and pushed it into the service elevator, and rode up through 19 floors of a company that had decided long ago exactly what he was. Westbridge Technologies was a branch. That word carried more weight inside the building than anyone said out loud. Somewhere above them was Westbridge Global, the parent company, a name that appeared on quarterly memos and in the header of documents nobody in the branch had authority to open. The people here competed for the attention of a headquarters they had never visited, and in that competition, the man pushing the mail cart did not register as a participant. Derek Collins had made a small hobby out of him. Derek ran the sales division, and he had the particular confidence of a man whose numbers had been good for 4 consecutive quarters. He would call Caleb over, hand him a folder, and ask him to deliver it to a manager whose office was 11 steps away, and then watch him walk those 11 steps. Sometimes it was coffee. Sometimes it was a suit jacket from the dry cleaner downstairs, or a box of personal items Derek wanted moved from his car to his office, and Derek would say it in front of others, in a voice pitched to Carrie. Madison Reed did it differently. She was young, recently promoted, and she had learned quickly that the fastest way to look like she belonged among the senior people was to draw a clear line between herself and everyone below her. She never used Caleb's name. In meetings when the mail arrived, she would say, "The delivery guy is here," and go back to her screen without looking up. The phrase caught on. Within a few months, there were people on the 12th floor who genuinely did not know he had a name. Caleb rarely responded. He set the envelope down where it belonged, said thank you when someone said something, and pushed the cart forward. There was no sharpness in it, no wounded dignity that anyone could point to and enjoy. He simply finished the route and went back down. What confused people more than anything was that he never seemed to want out. 3 years, and he had not applied for a single internal posting. He had not asked to be trained on anything. He had not cornered a manager by the elevator to explain that he was capable of more. In a building where everyone was visibly climbing, a man who stood still looked like a man who had already been measured and found lacking. The explanation the floor settled on was that he could not afford to gamble. He was a single father, and the mailroom shift ended at 5 and never ran late, and there were people in the building who assumed that was the whole story of him. It suited him to let them assume it. He wore the same plain gray uniform shirt, pushed the same cart, with the same bad wheel, came in at 6:40, and left at 5. And none of that was anything the company thought about, because the company did not think about him at all. On a Monday morning in early spring, Vanessa Sloan called every manager in the branch into the 19th floor conference room and closed the doors. She had run Westbridge Technologies for 6 years. In that time, the branch had grown from a satellite office into the 2nd largest unit under the parent company, and she had never once let anyone forget which of those 2 facts came first. She dressed with a precision that read as a warning. When she walked a hallway, conversations adjusted themselves around her, without anyone deciding to adjust them. The notice from headquarters was short. In a little over 2 weeks, Westbridge Global would send a new chief executive to take direct control of the branch. The transition would be immediate upon arrival. The identity of the incoming executive would not be disclosed in advance. The room did not react the way she expected. She had read it aloud in the flat tone of an administrative announcement, and for a moment, nobody understood that the floor had just moved. Then somebody asked whether that meant her position was being eliminated, and the temperature in the room changed. Vanessa's answer was smooth. She said that after 6 years of results, the parent company was reorganizing its leadership structure, and that she expected to be moving upward rather than sideways. She said the word upward twice. By lunch, the interpretation had spread through all 19 floors. Vanessa Sloan was being promoted to headquarters, and the new chief executive was arriving to take a seat she was vacating on her own terms. Almost nobody questioned it. It was the version that made the most sense to people who had spent years watching her win. Derek moved first. Within 2 days, he had rebuilt his quarterly presentation from the ground up, and he began stopping by Vanessa's floor without appointments, carrying printouts she had not requested. Madison took a different route. She started sending Vanessa summaries of her team's performance every Friday afternoon, unasked, formatted to match the style Vanessa used in her own reports. Both of them understood the arithmetic clearly. If Vanessa was going up, she would be in a position to reach back down, and the people standing closest to her when the door opened would be the ones who got pulled through. The rest of the building rearranged itself around that assumption. Projects that had been stalled for months suddenly acquired urgency. People who had not spoken in a year began having lunch together. 2 departments started quietly competing to be the one that presented first to whoever was arriving. Through all of it, Caleb pushed the cart. That was the part nobody thought about, and it was the part that mattered. The building had 100 rooms that closed their doors, and the mail went into every one of them. He came through the sales floor at 9:15 every morning, and the operations floor at 10, and the finance floor at 11:40, and by now he had become part of the furniture in a way that made people forget to stop talking when he entered. So he heard things. He heard a director on the 14th floor tell a coordinator that if she filed a complaint with human resources, the complaint would land on the desk of someone who played golf with him, and that she should think carefully about what she wanted her second year at the company to look like. He heard it through an open door while sliding envelopes into a wall rack, and neither of them noticed him. He watched a junior analyst named Ellis Vaughn spend 3 weeks building a client retention model, and then watched the manager above him present that model to Vanessa without ever saying Ellis's name. Ellis sat in the back of that room and applauded with everyone else. Afterward, Caleb passed him in the stairwell, and Ellis was standing on the landing looking at nothing in particular. He watched 2 capable people get passed over for a promotion that went to a third person whose only distinguishing quality was that she had been on Vanessa's team at her previous company. Nobody wrote that down anywhere. Everyone understood it, and he saw the numbers. Not the details, not the work papers, but the summary sheets that traveled between floors in unsealed interoffice envelopes and the printed decks that people left on the copier and forgot to collect. Once on the 11th floor, he picked up a discarded revenue summary from the recycling bin because it had client names on it and should not have been there. And he stood for a moment with it in his hand, reading the 3rd line down, and something in his face went very still. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and finished the route. He did not intervene. Not once in nearly 3 years, but he remembered every one of them. Rachel Bennett had been in the administrative group for 9 years longer than Derek, longer than Madison, longer than Vanessa. She knew where every historical file was stored and which of the old contracts had never been properly closed out. She was the person the sales division called when a client asked a question that required an actual answer. On the Thursday of that same week, Derek came out of his office holding a printed report and crossed the open floor to her desk. The problem, as he explained it, was that one of the year-end figures did not reflect the true performance of the division. A large contract had been signed in the first week of January. In his view, the work leading to it had been done the previous year, and therefore the revenue belonged in the previous year's column, where it would lift his division's annual result above the threshold that determined executive bonuses. He wanted the report adjusted, reprinted, and resubmitted, and he wanted the earlier version pulled. Rachel told him she could not move a signed contract into a closed period. She said it quietly, not as a challenge, in the tone of someone stating a rule she assumed he had simply forgotten. Derek threw the report down on her desk, hard enough that the top pages slid off the edge and scattered across the carpet. "Do what I tell you," he said, "if you still want to sit in that chair." The floor went quiet in the specific way an open-plan office goes quiet, which is that everyone keeps typing, and nobody is working. Rachel did not answer. She looked at the papers on the floor and then at her monitor, and she said nothing at all, which was the only safe thing available to her. Caleb had come onto the floor 30 seconds earlier with the afternoon delivery. He set the cart down, walked over, and knelt to gather the scattered pages. He squared them against the carpet, stood, and put them back on her desk in order. Derek watched him do it and started laughing. "Don't worry about her, Caleb," he said loud enough for the whole floor. "If she gets fired, I'm sure the mailroom still needs people." The laughter came from 4 or 5 desks, then a few more, the way it does when people are relieved that the tension has been given somewhere to go. Madison Reed was standing near the printer with a folder against her chest, and she laughed too. Caleb did not. He straightened up and looked directly at Derek, and he held the look long enough that the laughter thinned out and stopped on its own. One day, Caleb said, how you treated people is going to matter a great deal more than the numbers you carry into that conference room. Derek's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on amusement. He picked his report up off Rachel's desk, tapped Caleb once on the shoulder with the rolled edge of it, and said something about philosophy from the loading dock, and a few people laughed again, though not as many as before. Then he walked back to his office and shut the door. Caleb finished the delivery. He rode the service elevator down. He put the cart in its place against the wall under the flickering tube and stood there for a while with his hands on the handle. That evening, he stayed 40 minutes past 5. He opened a notebook, the ordinary kind, and on the first page he wrote the date, and then the floor, and then what he had seen in short sentences with no adjectives in them. The contract, the instruction, the exact words Derek had used, the names of the people who had been standing close enough to hear. He did it again the next day and the day after. He wrote down the director on the 14th floor and the golf comment. He wrote down Ellis Vaughn's retention model and the date it was presented and the name of the man who presented it. He wrote down the promotion that had gone to Vanessa's former colleague and the 2 people who had not been told why. He went back through 3 years in his memory and reconstructed what he could, marking clearly where he was certain and where he was not. It was not a plan. There was no strategy in the notebook, no list of targets, nothing about what he intended to do with any of it. He was not building a case against anyone, and he was not preparing to defend himself, because it had not yet occurred to him that he would need to. It was simpler than that, and harder to explain to anyone who had not stood in the middle of that floor and watched an entire department decide that a woman's humiliation was funny. For 3 years he had come into this building and moved through every one of its rooms and let all of it pass in front of him without touching it. He had watched people be diminished in small, daily increments by other people who had been rewarded for it. And every time he had told himself that observation was not the same as approval, and that staying quiet was not the same as agreeing. He no longer believed that. The notebook went into the flat leather case he carried in and out of the building every day because the metal desk in the mailroom had a drawer, but no lock, and the door to the room had no working lock either. He turned off the light and went home. Upstairs on the 19th floor, Vanessa Sloan was reviewing the arrangements for the arrival of the new chief executive now 14 days away, and Derek Collins was reprinting a report, and Madison Reed was drafting a Friday summary that she hoped would be read by someone at headquarters. None of them were thinking about the man in the mailroom. That would turn out to be the most expensive oversight any of them ever made. The notebook changed something in him, though not in any way the building could see. He still arrived at 6:40. He still ran the same route in the same order. What changed was that he stopped walking past. It began with Rachel. The morning after Derek scattered her report across the carpet, Caleb came through the sales floor and set her mail down, and instead of moving on, he said something short and specific. He told her that when Derek asked her for something over the phone, she should follow up with a written summary of the request sent to Derek, copying no one. Not as a complaint, just a record that the conversation had happened. He also told her that whatever she already had in her mailbox from the past 2 years, she should not delete a single line of it. Rachel looked at him for a long moment before she understood why that mattered. Then she said she would. He said the same kind of thing to others, always briefly. Always, while the cart was still in his hands. He told Ellis Vaughn to save his working files somewhere with a date stamp on them, so that if a model showed up in someone else's presentation, the timeline would answer the question before anyone had to ask it. He told a coordinator on the 14th floor that human resources was not the only channel, and that the parent company operated a compliance line that did not route through the branch, and the number for it was printed on the back of the poster in the 2nd floor break room where it had been ignored for 4 years. None of it was dramatic. It was the accumulated practical knowledge of a man who had watched this building operate from the inside for nearly 3 years, handed out in pieces to people who had nowhere else to get it. But the effect was visible. Rachel stopped absorbing verbal instructions and started converting them into paper. When Derek asked her a second time to reclassify the January contract, she replied by email restating his request in his own words and asking him to confirm it in writing. He did not reply. He came out of his office instead and told her that some things did not need to be documented, and Rachel told him she had already documented it. That afternoon, Derek stopped Caleb in the corridor outside the copy room. "Since when, Derek said, "does the mail guy have opinions about management?" Caleb told him he had not given anyone an opinion. He had told a colleague to keep a copy, which was what the company's own records policy required, and if there was a problem with the policy, that was a conversation for someone above both of them. Derek did not have an answer to that, which was the first time it had happened, and he covered it by laughing and walking away. But he did not forget it. Vanessa noticed differently. She did not care about Caleb, and she did not know his name until she looked it up. What she noticed was a pattern in the reports coming out of her own building. 2 employees had requested formal reviews of denied promotions in the same week. A coordinator on 14 had filed something through a channel that generated an inquiry from headquarters rather than an internal ticket. And a longtime administrator in sales had suddenly developed a habit of confirming everything in writing. It took her about a day to find the common element. When she pulled the badge access logs, she saw that the mailroom employee had been on every one of those floors, which meant nothing because he was on every floor every day. But she also had Derek in her office telling her he had seen the man talking to people, and that was enough. She had Caleb sent up on a Tuesday morning 9 days before the arrival of the new chief executive. Her office occupied the corner of the 19th floor and had a view of the river. She did not ask him to sit. She let him stand in front of the desk for a moment while she finished reading something on her screen, and then she looked up and told him without preamble that she had received reports that he was inserting himself into matters that did not concern him. Caleb said that he delivered mail and answered questions when people asked them. "Your job is to move mail," Vanessa said. "Don't confuse walking through every floor with having any right to interfere in them." He said, "I understand." She waited for more, because in 6 years of running this branch, nobody had ever left her office with only 2 words. Caleb did not offer any. He stood there entirely still, entirely unbothered, and something about the quality of his calm irritated her, more than an argument would have. She told him he could go. He went back down and finished the route. He did not stop. He did not tell anyone he had been called upstairs. But the notebook entry that evening was longer than usual, and at the bottom of it, he wrote the date and the word warning, and underlined it once. The audit notice arrived on a Thursday, 7 days out. It came from Westbridge Global, addressed to the branch chief executive, and it was worded as routine. An internal audit team would begin fieldwork at the branch the following Monday. The scope covered revenue recognition, contract closure, and expense classification for the preceding 2 fiscal years. Departments were to make records available on request. Vanessa read it twice. In 6 years, the parent company had never audited this branch without giving her at least a month of notice, and the timing was impossible to ignore. A new chief executive was arriving that same week, and headquarters wanted the books opened before he walked in. She sent an instruction to every department head within the hour. All files current, all reconciliations complete, nothing outstanding. She used the phrase "no surprises" 4 times in a message that was 6 lines long. Derek read it in his office with the door closed and did not move for a while. The January contract was the smallest of his problems. Over 2 years, he had made a habit of shaping the edges of his division's results, pulling revenue forward across period boundaries, holding costs back a quarter when a number was close to a threshold, reclassifying a handful of client credits as marketing expense so they would not reduce the top line. None of it was theft. Every dollar had existed. It was a matter of when he had told the company those dollars arrived, and the answer had consistently been whenever it made his division look best. It had worked because nobody upstream had reason to look, and because the person who prepared and filed the underlying documents did what she was told. He came out of his office at 4 in the afternoon and went to Rachel's desk. This time, he did not raise his voice. He leaned on the edge of the desk and spoke quietly, and what he asked for was worse than anything he had asked for before. He wanted 3 original submission files replaced with corrected versions before Monday. He wanted the originals removed from the shared drive. He said the word "corrected" as though it were a technical term. Rachel told him no. He told her she was making a mistake, that the audit team would find inconsistencies either way and would assign them to whoever's name was on the file, and that her name was on all 3. She told him that her name was on them because she had filed exactly what he gave her, and that she had the emails. 2 years of them. Derek's voice dropped further, and he said something about how long 9 years was, and how quickly 9 years could stop meaning anything, and Rachel's hand stayed flat on her desk. Caleb was 15 feet away at the wall rack with the afternoon delivery. Derek saw him and came across the floor fast. "You didn't hear anything," Derek said. Caleb turned and looked at him with no particular expression. "I heard enough," he said. For the first time, the amusement did not arrive. Derek stood there and understood in a slow, unpleasant way that the man in the gray uniform shirt had been standing at that wall rack every afternoon for 3 years and had been standing in similar places on 11 other floors every day before that, and that he had a memory, and that he had recently started giving people advice about documentation. The mail guy was no longer a joke Derek told to make the floor laugh. He was a witness, and Derek began to think about how to remove him. He went to Vanessa the next morning. He did not accuse Caleb of anything he could not make plausible. He said that over the past several weeks, he had noticed the mailroom employee handling documents that should never have been in his possession, that he had seen him reading materials off the copier, that he had appeared repeatedly in areas of the floor where sensitive files were stored, and that, with an audit starting Monday, and a new chief executive walking in 3 days after that, the branch could not afford an uncontrolled leak. He mentioned almost in passing that the employee had been coaching staff on how to route information to headquarters. That last part was the one that landed. Vanessa had already warned the man herself and been given 2 words and a blank face. And she had spent the days since then aware that something in her building was reaching past her. She told Derek to bring her something concrete. He understood exactly what she meant. The file he chose was a bound financial summary, marked confidential, an internal pricing and margin analysis that existed in 4 controlled copies. That Friday afternoon, 20 minutes before the end of the day, he took the copy from the sales division cabinet down to the ground floor and put it in the lower tray of the mail cart underneath a stack of empty interoffice envelopes and went back up. On Monday morning, with the audit team already checking into the building's guest system, Derek came down to the mailroom with 2 managers and a member of the facility's staff and said he needed to check whether a missing document had been misrouted. He found it in 90 seconds. He held it up in front of everyone, and the reaction on the faces around him did the rest of the work. Caleb was summoned to the 19th floor at 9:40. Vanessa had the file on the desk in front of her, closed squared to the edge. Derek stood to her right near the window. The head of human resources, a careful man named Peter Holloway, sat in the corner with a legal pad and did not look up. "Can you explain," Vanessa said, "why this was in your cart?" Caleb said that he did not put it there. She asked him who did. He said he did not know, and that he had not opened it, and that the lower tray of the cart was where he stacked empty envelopes, and that the cart sat unlocked in the mailroom overnight, and the mailroom door had not had a working lock since before he started. Nobody in the room wrote that down. Then he said one more thing, and he said it, looking at Holloway, rather than at Vanessa. He said that a bound document had been buried under a stack of envelopes in the lower tray of a cart in a windowless room at the back of the ground floor, and that the man who came to look for it had found it in 90 seconds, and that somebody in this room ought to be curious about how he knew which tray. Holloway's pen stopped moving. He did not write that down either. Derek spoke from the window without turning around. 3 years in the mailroom, he said. I suppose at some point he started thinking he belonged on the executive floor. Caleb ignored him and asked Vanessa a single question. He asked her to pull the corridor camera covering the mailroom entrance for Friday afternoon between 4:30 and 5 and the service elevator camera for the same window. He said it plainly, without heat, the way a man asks for something he already knows is there. Vanessa said the security system was not going to be used to relitigate a document that had been found in his possession. He asked again and named the times again, and said that the footage was retained for 30 days and would answer the question in under 5 minutes. She refused a second time. That refusal was the moment the room stopped being about the file. Everyone in it understood at different depths that the question had already been decided before Caleb walked in. Vanessa had a new chief executive arriving in 3 days, an audit team setting up on the 11th floor, and an employee at the bottom of her building who had been teaching her staff how to reach past her. She had wanted a reason. Derek had built her one. She told Caleb to leave the building and wait for a call. She never made that call. She did something larger. On Wednesday morning one day before the new chief executive was due to arrive, Vanessa Sloan sent a notice to every employee in the branch requiring their attendance in the main lobby at 10 o'clock, and a second notice separately requiring Caleb Morgan to be present. 300 people came down. They filled the floor between the turnstiles and the elevator bank and stood along the mezzanine railing above, and the ones at the back climbed onto the low planters to see. Nobody knew what it was about. The prevailing guess was that she was going to announce her own promotion. Vanessa came out of the elevator with Derek and Madison a step behind her and stopped at the center of the lobby, where the floor was inlaid with the company mark. Caleb was already standing there in the gray uniform shirt. She spoke for less than 4 minutes. She said that an employee had accessed confidential financial material he had no authorization to handle, that he had exceeded his role repeatedly and been warned, and that with an audit underway, the company had a duty to act without hesitation. She did not raise her voice. She had the tone of someone performing a necessary and slightly tiresome duty. Caleb tried to answer. He said that he had asked for the security footage and been refused twice, and that any of them could check it in 5 minutes, and he had gotten roughly that far when Vanessa spoke over him and told him he had said enough. Then she walked forward, took the badge clipped to his shirt pocket, tore it free hard enough to pull the fabric, and dropped it on the floor in front of his shoes. It landed face up and skidded a few inches. Derek laughed. It came out sharp in the acoustics of the lobby. Madison laughed a half-second after him from behind Vanessa's left shoulder, and then a handful of other people laughed too. The same relieved laughter as before from the same kind of people. "The new chief executive arrives tomorrow," Vanessa said. "I don't intend for him to walk into this building and find employees like you still in it." The lobby went silent. Caleb looked at the badge on the floor. In his pocket was a phone, and on that phone was a number that would have ended all of this inside of 60 seconds. He had thought about it on Monday in her office when she refused the footage the second time, and he thought about it now, with 300 people watching. He did not reach for it. He had spent 3 years trying to learn what this branch actually was, and there was one question he had never been able to answer from the mailroom, because the answer only existed in a moment like this. How far would she go when she was certain nobody could stop her? She was answering it in front of everyone. He bent down and picked up the badge. He held it, looked at the photograph on it, and then looked up at her. There was no anger in his face. There was nothing to appeal to either. "Then you should be on time tomorrow," he said. Vanessa laughed. Caleb turned and walked out through the turnstiles and across the plaza, the leather case under his arm, and the doors closed behind him. And 3 years at Westbridge Technologies ended with 300 people watching a man collect his own name off the floor. At least that was what everyone in the lobby believed had just happened. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the lobby was full again. The building had been decorated overnight. A banner hung across the front of the mezzanine railing, dark blue with the company mark on it, reading, "Welcome to Westbridge Technologies." Someone had set up a small riser near the elevator bank with a microphone on a stand. The floor between the turnstiles and the elevators had been cleared, and 300 people stood in the same space where 22 hours earlier they had watched a man pick his badge up off the ground. Nobody talked about that. A few people had said something quietly in the stairwells the night before, and by morning the subject had been put away, the way uncomfortable things get put away in an office when there is a larger event to look at. Vanessa Sloan stood at the front, closest to the elevators, in a charcoal suit she had clearly chosen for photographs. Derek Collins stood just behind her right shoulder. Madison Reed stood behind her left. Both of them had positioned themselves early and had not moved in 20 minutes. The audit team was on the 11th floor and had been since Monday. Vanessa had spent the previous evening reviewing what they had requested so far and had decided the scope looked manageable. She had also decided that firing the mailroom employee in public had been the correct call because it demonstrated on the record that this branch acted decisively when confidentiality was breached. At 8:30, the executive elevator chimed. It was the one on the far right, the one that ran directly from the underground level to the 19th floor and stopped nowhere in between. And it required a keycard that fewer than 10 people in the building carried. The doors opened. A man stepped out in a navy suit. Vanessa moved forward with her hand already extending, and then her hand stopped, and then the rest of her stopped, and she stood in the middle of the lobby floor with her arm partly raised and nothing on her face at all. Derek made a sound. Not a word. Madison's mouth opened and stayed open. Behind them, the murmur started at the front and rolled backward through 300 people in about 4 seconds, and then it stopped because everyone had gotten there. The man who had walked out of the executive elevator was Caleb Morgan. No gray uniform shirt, no cart. He crossed the lobby without hurrying and stopped in front of Vanessa close enough that she had to look up slightly, and he did not say anything to her. An older man in a dark suit had come out of the elevator behind him carrying a leather folder, and he stepped up onto the riser and pulled the microphone toward himself. He was Arthur Whitfield, chairman of Westbridge Global, and about 40 people in the room recognized him from the annual report. "Good morning," Whitfield said. "On behalf of the board of Westbridge Global, I'd like to introduce the new Chief Executive Officer of Westbridge Technologies, Mr. Caleb Morgan." The room did not make a sound. The truth came out in the 90 seconds that followed, and it rearranged 3 years of memory for every person standing on that floor. Caleb Morgan had never been a mailroom employee. He was a senior executive of Westbridge Global, the parent company, and had been for a long time before he ever set foot in this branch. He had used his own name for all 3 years, and it had cost him nothing, because his work at headquarters had been internal operations and post-acquisition review, the kind of role that never appears in a press release and never sits for a photograph. There was no picture of him in any annual report. Inside this building, only one person had known what the name meant, and he had spent those 3 years on the 19th floor of a different building 400 miles away. Whitfield had approved the arrangement personally. The proposal came to him 3 years earlier, after headquarters began receiving signals from this branch that did not fit together. The reported results were excellent. The attrition numbers were not. Employees were leaving at nearly twice the rate of comparable units, and a disproportionate share of them were leaving within 18 months of being hired, which is the pattern of people who leave because of the people above them rather than because of the work. At the same time, several revenue lines showed a shape the parent company's analysts described as unusually smooth, quarter after quarter landing just above the thresholds that triggered division bonuses. The standard response would have been a formal review. A team would arrive, request documents, interview managers in conference rooms, and produce a report. Caleb had argued against it. He told Whitfield that a branch which had learned to manage its numbers would have no trouble managing an audit, and that whatever was actually wrong in that building would not be visible to anyone who walked in through the front door wearing a visitor badge. So he proposed the other thing. He asked to be placed inside at the lowest position available, with a constructed employment record for a period he initially estimated at 6 months. The mailroom was not a random choice. It was the only role in the building with a legitimate reason to enter nearly every room on nearly every floor every single day, and to be entirely unremarkable while doing it. Access without attention. There was no other job in that structure that offered both. 6 months became a year, because a year was how long it took him to see the shape of what Derek Collins was doing to the sales figures, and to understand that it required cooperation from people who were not being given a choice. A year became 2, because the pattern of stolen credit and blocked promotions was not one department's problem, and mapping it took time. 2 became 3, because Vanessa Sloan never once did anything actionable herself, and the thing he needed to document was not a crime, but a culture, and cultures reveal themselves slowly. All of it had been spent being looked past, handed coffee orders and personal boxes and errands 11 steps long, called the delivery guy by people who never learned he had a name. It had also been spent watching every person in that building show him exactly who they were, in the specific way people do when they are certain the person in front of them will never matter to their career. Caleb stepped up onto the riser. He did not fire anyone in the first minute. He did not name Vanessa. He reached into the inside pocket of the navy jacket and took out the employee badge, the one she had torn off his shirt the previous morning, and set it face up on the small table beside the microphone. Everyone in the front third of the room could see what it was. "Yesterday," he said, "this piece of plastic made me the lowest thing in the building to some of the people standing here. Today, a title makes some of those same people want to shake my hand." He let the room hold that. "I'm the same man." Nobody laughed. Nobody had laughed since the elevator opened, and nobody would for the rest of the morning. He told them what the last 3 years had actually been in plain language, and then he told them what he had done with it. There was a review. It had run the entire time. Its findings were now with the parent company, and the audit team upstairs had been working from them since Monday, which was why the audit had come without the usual notice, and why its scope had been drawn where it was. He knew who had taken credit for work belonging to their subordinates, and the dates, and the presentations, and the names. He knew who had shaped reports which periods, and by how much. He knew who had ordered an employee to alter a submission and threatened her position when she refused twice the second time 7 days ago. On the Thursday, the audit notice arrived, and he knew he said which people had treated him decently when they had every reason to believe he could never do a thing for them, and which had treated him like a servant. Derek Collins had gone the color of paper. The evidence against him was not the notebook, and it never had been. The notebook had only ever told Caleb where to look. What ended Derek's career was what Rachel Bennett had kept 2 years of original email chains in which he had put his own instructions in writing, and on top of those 2 weeks of written confirmations she had begun sending the morning after he scattered her report across the carpet, each one restating a verbal request in his own words, each one time-stamped, several of them unanswered, in a way that was worse for him than a reply would have been. Underneath all of it sat the 3 original submission files he had told her to remove from the shared drive, which she had not removed, and which had never left it. And underneath that sat 5 minutes of security footage. Caleb had asked Vanessa for it 3 times, twice in her office on Monday, and once in the lobby on Wednesday, with 300 people listening. and she had refused every time. She had not understood that a refusal was not a deletion. The parent company's security office held its own retention of the branch's camera system, and Whitfield had pulled the file on Wednesday afternoon, 4 hours after the lobby. It ran on the lobby display while Caleb stood there, Friday, 4:41 in the afternoon. The corridor outside the mailroom, Derek Collins walking in with a bound document under his arm. 53 seconds. Derek Collins walking out without it. The lobby made a low collective sound that was not quite a word. Derek did not say anything, because there was nothing available to say. 2 people on the floor near him stepped slightly away, which is a thing that happens instinctively and is impossible to unsee. Near the back, Peter Holloway from Human Resources looked at the screen for a long moment, and then looked down at his shoes, and did not look up again. Vanessa Sloan's situation was different, and in the end, worse. She had not falsified anything. She had not planted the file. What the review established was that she had been told in writing on 4 separate occasions across 2 years about conduct in her building that she chose not to examine, because examining it would have complicated results she was being praised for. She had built a branch in which the fastest way to advance was proximity to her, and the fastest way to become invisible was to raise a problem. And on Wednesday morning, with the formal request for security footage on the record and an audit already underway, she had refused that request twice, and then fired the man in front of 300 people rather than spend 5 minutes checking whether he was telling the truth. Both of them were suspended that morning pending a formal investigation by the parent company. They were escorted out through the same turnstiles Caleb had walked out of the day before, but he did not turn the rest of the day into a reckoning, and this was the part nobody in the lobby had expected. The people who had laughed were not fired. Madison Reed, who had given him a nickname instead of a name and had laughed on Wednesday from behind. Vanessa's shoulder was not fired. Caleb said once that if the standard for employment in this company became how a person had treated Caleb Morgan, then he would have replaced one bad system with a worse one. What he changed instead was the machinery. Every manager's evaluation would from that point carry a weighted component built from the people below them, collected independently, and reported outside the manager's chain. Internal complaints would no longer be resolved by the division they concerned. Promotion decisions would require a written record of the criteria applied and would be reviewable by anyone who had been passed over. And the individual cases were reopened. Rachel Bennett's 9 years of performance history, every line of it filed by people who had reason to keep her quiet, went to an independent panel for reassessment. So did Ellis Vaughn's, along with the dated working files for a client retention model that had been presented to Vanessa Sloan under someone else's name. So did the 2 people who had been passed over 11 months earlier, and the coordinator on the 14th floor, who had been told to think carefully about her second year. Several months later, the building did not feel like the same place. The attrition numbers came down first, then the internal complaint volume went up for 1 quarter, and then fell. Which is the pattern you see when people stop believing that reporting something is pointless. Promotions started going to people who had not eaten lunch with anyone in particular. The audit closed with restatements to 2 prior periods and a set of controls that made the shape of Derek's old numbers impossible to repeat. Caleb kept an office on the 19th floor, and he kept the habit of walking the building. One morning, he came through the ground floor and went past the loading dock and pushed open the door at the back. The tube overhead had been replaced, and the light in the room was even for the first time in years. The cart was there, the same steel frame, the same wheel that pulled left. A new employee was working at it, trying to load 4 document boxes that had been stacked badly, and the top one was already going over the edge as Caleb came in. He took his jacket off, laid it on the metal desk, crossed the room in 3 steps, and caught the box with both hands before it hit the floor. The young man turned around and saw who was holding it. "Sir," he said, "you don't have to do that." Caleb settled the box back onto the stack and squared it. "I know," he said. He put a hand on the frame and helped push the cart out through the door and into the service elevator, and he held the door while the boxes went in, and then he went back for his jacket. 3 years in that room had taught him something no business school had ever managed to teach him, and it was this: a title gives a person power, but the way they treat people who have none is what tells you who they actually are. Never look down on a person because their work seems small, because a person's worth was never printed on the badge they are wearing. A healthy workplace is not built by everyone respecting the chief executive. It is built when everyone from the chief executive to the lowest paid person in the building is treated with the same dignity. And sometimes, the person you walk past every day without looking at is the one who sees most clearly who you really are